Fire Emblem Three Houses is the 16th entry in the Fire Emblem series. When it launched on July 26, 2019, it was met with the utmost praise. Countless review sites gave it scores in the 90s and above, while fans alike praised it for its story, characters, and gameplay. I bought this game at launch thinking it would be a truly special experience, and as I made my way through it, all I found was disappointment due to the sheer number of fundamental design flaws that it contained. I do not like Fire Emblem Three Houses. I think it is a bad game. I believe its nuances did nothing but detract from its quality. I have to be blunt. There were times where the writing was downright insufferable, and if it wasn't for the impressive review scores, I probably would have never gotten the game at all. For some context, this was my first experience with a Fire Emblem game. I wasn't too familiar with the series outside of it being a strategy game with RPG elements. I came out of Three Houses hating the protagonist. They caused so many of the awkward storytelling moments and made the dialogue system entirely self-defeating. I don't like the story because it felt like a convoluted mess of poorly handled mysteries that can only be truly resolved if the player goes through every route in the game. The gameplay wasn't any better. The Monastery seemed like a cool idea at the start, but it only became a repetitive slog as time went on. The game also has the worst case of map reuse in the series, so the core gameplay is arguably worse than in any other Fire Emblem game. It has good ideas, but the execution of the ideas surrounding them were atrocious. Ever since this experience, I wanted to see if other Fire Emblem games shared the same issues that existed in Three Houses. Since then, I have played Radiant Dawn, Path of Radiance, Shadows of Valentia, and most recently, Fire Emblem Fates. Each of these experiences have been a lot more enjoyable because they either handled the same concepts better, or they didn't have a lot of the mechanics that I didn't like about Three Houses. I distinctly remember people would celebrate Three Houses for not having the issues that existed in Fates. As I have been making my way through Fates on both the Conquest and Birthright routes, I do not see where this is coming from. I do believe that Fates is a much better game. I believe the protagonist is a lot more tolerable since they have a reasonable justification for being the main character. The story was a lot more straightforward and structured better. It may not have a complex web of mysteries, but it still felt more engaging. My castle does not become tiring because it's better integrated in the game without being downright tedious. There were also plenty of maps to make each route feel more unique, so the gameplay could still feel fresh on subsequent playthroughs. Three Houses, on the other hand, simply took what Fates was doing well and managed to make it worse to an almost embarrassing degree. Three Houses helped me find other strategy games that I can have fun with, but it was such an unpleasant experience that is one of the few first-party Nintendo games I can say I regret playing. Let me make myself clear. Pokemon Sword and Shield is a fine game, but Three Houses is the one that I wish I never got. I know it is a bit of an unpopular opinion to say that Fates is a decent game and Three Houses is garbage, but that is the opinion that I have. With that said, if you want to take a critical look at how Three Houses fails on both its own merits and when being compared to other Fire Emblem games, then let us begin with discussing how Fates is actually a superior game. Since New Mystery the Emblem, Fire Emblem games have been doubling down on avatar characters. Fates and Three Houses continue this trend, but I am honestly inclined to prefer Fates' implementation for the My unit. The player in Fates is able to change Corrin's gender, eye color, eye shape, hairstyle, hair color, facial features, voice, accessories, and assign a boon and a bane. There are a whole slew of options to tailor Corrin to whatever design the player pleases. Three Houses, on the other hand, got rid of most of the character customization options, so the choices boil down to a male and a female form. This isn't an outright bad idea. I can understand that development resources are limited and had to be spent elsewhere. Fates had the advantage of being able to reuse the system that existed in Awakening. I only find it to be problematic because of the actual design for the avatar character. It seems a little misogynistic when the male character can dress professionally, wearing an armored outfit with a professor's coat, while the female design has to reveal as much skin as possible, wear short shorts, wear leggings, have a stomach window and a chest window just to be more appealing. There is an alternative outfit that is better, but keep in mind that it cannot be worn without purchasing the expansion pass, and it's literally missing the best part of the outfit, being the hat. I am not against a character being provocatively designed in general, but I feel like when it is an avatar, players should at least be able to wear the kinds of outfits that they are comfortable with. Corrin's outfit is certainly weird. I am not fond of the thigh window that they have going on, but at least it's not blatantly sexualized. It would have been nice if there were more options for hairstyles and body types like in Three Houses' predecessors, but even if that's not possible due to time constraints or that simply not being the vision of the game, then I would rather the character design at least be tasteful. Female Byleth is just pandering. It's like if the infamous Camilla scene from Fates had to be in every cutscene of the game just because you wanted to play as a female character. I know people are probably going to say to stick to the male version for Byleth if I don't like the female design, but that's missing the point. Choosing between a male and female form should not be the choice of being sexualized or not. Furthermore, this choice is more than just a male and female form. Most of the customization options are tied to the class system. I am a little divisive on this class system. It feels like the game took one step forward and one step back, which is a recurring theme for the game in general. Fire Emblem Fates got rid of gender-locked classes, so the characters can essentially be whatever they want. There is even a support conversation between Tsubaki and Selena that pokes fun at this. Even though Fire Emblem games traditionally treat Pegasus Knights as a role for female characters, men have always been able to ride them. Three Houses, for some weird reason, decided to bring it back. So even though the class system provides more flexibility for what role characters can play on the battlefield, there is an arbitrary restriction on them. Female Byleth is the only one who can be a Pegasus Knight or a Gremory. Only male Byleth can be a War Master. It's very disappointing seeing that this wasn't an issue for Fates, but it was put back into Three Houses, even though this game would have arguably benefited from no gender-locked classes more than Fates did. I find it to be disappointing that you can create a specific build just to find out that the best class for the build isn't even an option with the form that you've chosen. There are other character customization options in these games, but they aren't very significant. The name in Three Houses just populates a couple of menus. It is never explicitly stated throughout the entire game. Byleth has a canonical last name being Eisner, so I'm not sure why I didn't just have characters refer to them as Professor Eisner.
Shepherd, shepherd, shepherd.
Rex?
Just saying the professor feels too impersonal, and it's rather awkward when considering that there are several other professors at the monastery. Meanwhile, the name option in Fates actually does appear in the text. Albeit that is an advantage of not being voice acted, I just feel like Three Houses could have found a better middle ground and referred to Byleth by at least their last name. So, to summarize, the character customization has fewer options for the design of the protagonist, it sexualizes the female version for the sake of pandering, brings back gender-locked classes even though it wasn't a problem in Fates, and it for some reason doesn't allow any characters to refer to Byleth by their name, which all feels like a step back from what Fates managed to accomplish with the same mechanic. It is a popular opinion to say that Three Houses has a good story. I don't agree with that notion. The story isn't outright bad, but the telling of the story was terrible. Fates may not have a particularly well-written story either, especially when compared to its contemporaries like Xenoblade, but I can appreciate it for not having the same kinds of flaws that made Three Houses' story insufferable. Fates, much like Three Houses, offers several different routes and split paths. I like how Fates introduces its story more. The first 6 chapters essentially introduce the main conflict between Nor and Hoshido, it gives some insight to Corrin's life with Nor, and then it reveals that Corrin is actually born under Hoshidan royalty. Then, after witnessing innocent lives being killed in the Hoshidan capital, he must choose whether to side with Nor, Hoshido, or follow his own path. This all happens within the first 6 chapters. It does a fine job at giving context for each route before the player player must commit to one of them. On top of that, the game can be restarted from Chapter 6 using the Branch of Fate option. By doing so, subsequent playthroughs do not have to repeat what is essentially the game's tutorial. They can simply start when the meaningful route differences begin. Compare and contrast it with Three Houses. This game splits its routes after the prologue when the player chooses a house to teach. The only context that the player gets for the stories within the routes is one line of monologue about each of the house leaders right after meeting them. I doubt most players remembered exactly what Byleth was thinking of the house leaders before choosing. Not to mention that this is just lazy foreshadowing. This is the first time Byleth met Dimitri. How would they even know Dimitri is harboring a darker personality? Xenoblade, show them how it's done.
In my head, there are two versions of me. One of them is saying that. It's telling me, listen to what Dunban said.
What about the other one?
It keeps shouting, make them pay. Destroy every single one of them. And it won't stop getting louder.
That doesn't sound like you. Sure it ain't my voice in there.
I also really do not like the decision that splits the paths. Asking the player which house do you wish to teach is a vastly different question from which nation do you side allegiance with. With Fates, the decision that branches the paths was not innocuous. It clearly had drastic consequences for the rest of the story that Corrin will be embarking on. When I first played Three Houses, I knew about alternate routes, but I didn't know when the split actually occurred. I assumed this game would do what any sensibly designed game would do, and wait until after I had enough context for each route before expecting me to commit to one of them. I picked the Black Eagles route, which turned out to be the worst one in the game. By the time I realized my mistake, my options were to continue bearing through the poorly written story in the hopes that it gets better later, or start over and lose about 20 hours worth of progress. I've never seen a game do this. Not having a Branch of Fate option means that the player needs to replay the first 12 chapters at least 3 times just to play through all the routes. Assuming that someone kept a save right after the prologue, this includes Three Houses, Familiar Scenery, Mutiny in the Mist, The Goddess's Rite of Rebirth, Tower in the Black Winds, Rumors of a Reaper, Field of the Eagle and the Lion, The Flame in the Darkness, The Cause of Sorrow, Where the Goddess Dwells, Throne of Knowledge, and To War. There are some story differences in the first half of the game, but I don't think they do a good job justifying being exclusive to one route. For example, in the Blue Lions route, there is a scene where Dimitri explains his relationship with Edelgard to Byleth. This scene does not occur on the Black Eagles route. When one story has context that other routes are missing, the individual routes end up feeling incomplete. I don't see any good reason that the first half of the game couldn't have been a linear story that set up the events for the war era, and then, when the time skip occurs, Byleth must choose which nation to lead or to reform the Knights of Saros. Unfortunately, that's not the game we got. I suppose while talking about the structure of the game, I should mention the elephant in the room. Fates has each route on a separate cartridge. You have to buy Conquest to side with Nor, Birthright to side with Hoshido, and Revelation to choose your own path. Three Houses having them all on one cartridge is an improvement, but that is all the more reason that I'm baffled that there is no equivalence to the Branch of Fate option. It may be annoying having to buy a game in installments just to experience everything, but at least Fates made it less annoying to resume the game on another route. Three Houses took one step forward and one step back. Another reason that I like Fates more is because the story is straightforward. Three Houses felt like a convoluted mess, especially in the first half of the game, while Fates felt like the characters were actually trying to accomplish something. I really did not like how the first half of Three Houses was just throwing out as many mysteries as it possibly could with no sense of how to manage them well. Wow, this is quite the battle. I look forward to finding out what caused this conflict as I keep playing. Oh, who is this green-haired girl in Byleth's head, and why does she have amnesia? I'll just have to keep playing and find out. Who is the Flame Emperor and what are they planning? Keep playing and maybe you'll find out. Rhea looks an awful lot like that Saros character. I guess I'll keep playing and maybe find out how they're related, even though the game doesn't seem to be interested in acknowledging this plot point. Why doesn't Geralt trust Lady Rhea? How does he know her? And does it have something to do with the Great Fire from 20 years ago? Keep playing and maybe you'll find out, even though there is no logical reason that Byleth cannot just ask him, what is Byleth's crest? And might it have something to do with is Sothis? Keep playing and maybe you will find out, even though Sothis seems to already know the answer.
Yes, you who bears the flames within. The flames within.
Who is Solon, and why did he cause the tragedy in Ramire Village? Keep playing and maybe you'll find out, unless it's one of the routes where those who slither in the dark is completely irrelevant. Lady Rhea is singing a song that Sothis wrote. I wonder why she would do that. What does the song mean, and how does she know it? Keep playing and maybe you'll find out. Solon seems to know who Sothis is. I guess I'll just keep playing and hope the game eventually decides to go somewhere, and the game constantly does that. It's very annoying being told to just be patient in the hopes that something actually happens, but in actuality, nothing happens until the time skip. The first half of this game is just throwing as many mysteries as possible in the hopes that it eventually leads somewhere. The mysteries around the Flame Emperor and Nemesis were interesting, but when the game gets to a point where I have more questions than answers, even after 10 chapters, then it begins to feel like the story isn't actually progressing. Three Houses eventually does answer these questions, especially if the player does complete all of the routes. The issue I have with the mysteries is that there are just too many of them being thrown out at once, and some of them do not have a good justification for being a mystery. A lot of what I just listed happens in the first 2 hours of the game. They really needed to be spaced out better. A well-managed mystery story actually takes the time to solve a mystery before delving into another one. It doesn't just vomit them out all over the place and hopes that the audience is patient enough to wait for it to eventually get sorted out. Furthermore, I never felt like Byleth was even trying to solve the mysteries. Another feature of a good mystery is that the protagonist is the kind of person who will go out of their way to seek answers. However, Byleth would just meander around the monastery until someone handed them the solution. They found out why Geralt doesn't trust Lady Rhea after Sothis reminds them to search his office. They find out who the Flame Emperor is by Edelgard just outing herself at a convenient time. They find out how they were born when Rhea just decides to tell them. They never took the time to seek these answers, which makes the conclusions feel unsatisfying and just downright forced. Fates may not have as much going on as Three Houses in terms of the story, but at least it felt like the characters were trying to accomplish something. For example, when Corrin chooses to side with Nor, Garen decides to give Corrin a couple of tests, the first one being to suppress the Ice Tribe's rebellion. So what does the next few missions involve? Traveling to the Ice Tribe to do just that. When Corrin gets back, King Garen sends him on another test. Wow, these characters are actually taking the time to complete the actions that advance the story. I'll admit, the Birthright route isn't as good as the Conquest route in terms of story, but I still prefer it over Three Houses on any route. The Conquest route works better because there is a clear sense that Garen has a plan that he is executing for Corrin. I don't get that same sense when playing the Birthright route. For example, the first thing that happens is Corrin and his allies travel to Fort Jinya to tend to the wounded, just to be attacked by Nor. However, I'm not quite sure why Nor would even attack a hospital. There wouldn't be any threatening soldiers at a hospital. The first couple of chapters in Birthright is just a lot of moving from set piece to set piece and then getting ambushed by Nor. However, I still like Fates more because it establishes a conflict, focuses on it, and then resolves it before introducing a new conflict. My opinion on the stories may change over time, but I am 10 chapters on both the Conquest and Birthright routes, and I am still enjoying my experience more than the first 10 chapters of Three Houses. Fates has a basic structure for a story, but I prefer it over a wild goose chase of mysteries that may not actually go anywhere, and a protagonist who isn't really doing anything to solve them. Three Houses also has the disadvantage of the calendar system. I found that more often than not, it only made it more difficult to actually want to pursue the story. Since the player has a finite number of days that they can spend for exploration, hosting a seminar, battling, or resting, I never felt comfortable skipping to the end of the month, even when it seemed like there were more pressing matters to attend to. It always felt like I should be spending those days doing something, otherwise it's just a waste of a finite resource. The pacing of Three Houses' story seemed a lot slower because of this. It essentially wasn't advancing at a natural pace. It was advancing in monthly increments. Since Fates doesn't have a calendar system, the missions can be done whenever the player wants. If they just want to advance their story, they could. There are no consequences for advancing advancing the story too quickly other than the obvious difficulty curve. Meanwhile, in Three Houses, they could accidentally miss out on an important story sequence or lose access to a paralog mission simply because they just wanted to see more of the story. This wasn't a problem in Fates. Corrin is also a more tolerable protagonist who works better in his respective game than Byleth did. Since he is a spoken protagonist, it is easier for me to endure him, even if I do not like certain aspects of how the story handles him. I can just watch the story unfold as though he is simply a character I disagree with, not a self-insert that I despise to play as. With Byleth, on the other hand, the game is constantly being interrupted to display dialogue prompts that don't matter. Regardless of what the player says, the story is essentially on rails. Everybody's experience with it is going to be about the same. The only two decisions that really matter is which house to teach, and on the Black Eagle's route, if Edelgard is spared or killed. Time after time, the game either mishandles the dialogue system or misses the point of it entirely. When Byleth first wakes up, the player must tell Geralt about a dream they had, instead of just having the protagonist speak with their words. When Hanneman and Manuela introduce each other, Byleth can ask about 2 of the 4 things they listed, but no matter what they ask, Hanneman just cuts Manuela off rather than letting the player engage in a conversation.
Spare our colleague the needless chatter, Manuela.
When Sothis suggests following Lady Rhea, the player isn't even allowed to say yes, even though that is clearly what the game wants to happen, and that's what's going to happen anyway.
Someone's singing. From over there.
I trade all for your sweet embrace.
When Manuela wants to know if her problems with her love life are her fault, you can't even give a direct answer because the game wants Byleth to just shy away from telling it how it is. When the Flame Emperor asks Byleth to join them, you actually do get a yes or no option, but saying yes means that the Flame Emperor can suddenly tell if Byleth is lying.
You are lying. I can see that you cannot contain your fury toward me.
Even though Byleth is essentially an emotionless husk for the rest of the game. But I guess Edelgard can tell exactly what Byleth is thinking when the plot needs it to happen. This isn't a dialogue system that is being used to mold the character however the player wants, or to provide funny joke responses. It is a lazy solution to give the player an illusion of choice when the game objectively would be better without the mechanic at all. Since Fire Emblem games traditionally have a spoken protagonist, this was an issue created in Three Houses. This complaint does not apply to any other game in the series. I'm not against a franchise changing and trying new things, but in this case, it was handled in the worst way possible. If Byleth was a spoken protagonist like Corrin, and the dialogue system was omitted from the game, nothing about it would have changed. The dialogue systems made Three Houses feel like playing Mad Libs with the Mad Libs already filled in. It just defeats the purpose. One thing that makes Byleth being a silent protagonist especially annoying is the choice for Byleth's voice actor. In the Japanese audio for the game, the male voice actor is Yusuke Kobayashi. If that name sounds familiar, he plays Subaru Natsuki from Re:Zero, Senku from Dr. Stone, Zell from Interspecies Reviewers, and he played roles in plenty of other works. It baffles me that somebody with this kind of talent is playing a silent protagonist of all things. I reiterate, at least with Corrin, they are their own character. The player is never asked to speak for them because the writers were able to commit to making him his own thing. I can tolerate him even if I don't necessarily like him. Byleth represents something worse than bad writing. Lazy writing. They don't need to be a character with thoughts, motivations, or even an interest in pursuing the plot without other characters telling them to. They just need to be a plot device who does whatever the story needs to happen regardless of whatever logical inconsistencies arise. Corrin has a better justification for being a part of the story. He is a child of Hashidan royalty, and he was raised under Norian royalty. It is believable that he would have to make the decision of which nation to side with when considering the events of the first 6 chapters and his familial ties. Byleth does not have the same advantages. They become a professor, but I don't understand why, other than, say it with me, the plot needed it to happen. They don't seem to have any interest in teaching. Geralt explicitly tells Byleth to watch out for Lady Rhea, almost like they shouldn't accept the job at all, but they do so anyway just because. Byleth's relationships also have a tendency to contradict each other. There is a scene just after Geralt dies where Byleth cries for the first time. This was a powerful scene because Byleth has to watch the only person they really knew die. At least it would be if it wasn't for Setta's C-rank support conversation. During this conversation, he asks Byleth several questions about their life, one of which is if Geralt is Byleth's father.
You are the child of Geralt Eisner, correct? That's quite a vague reply for such a basic question.
Byleth cannot answer this question. They don't know. They also don't know enough about Geralt's life because Geralt kept a lot of secrets from their own child. I have to simultaneously believe that Byleth cares enough about Geralt to cry over his death, but not enough to try to learn anything about him. They don't even understand what kind of relationship he has with Geralt. At least with Corrin, I haven't found a support conversation that goes against what appears to be a major character moment for him. He understands the types of relationships that he has with the people around him. The only real issue I have with Corrin is that he seems incredibly naive. For example, there is a scene in the Birthright route where Zola wants to accompany him, but even though everyone agrees that it is a bad idea, Corrin allows him anyway. Zola tried to kill Corrin and his allies, but he just chooses to let Zola tag along. Maybe as I get later into the game, it actually goes somewhere, but for now, it just seems like a really bad idea. Corrin is not what I would call an amazing protagonist. Nonetheless, it is a lot easier for me to see the good things that he brings to the story than to do the same thing for Byleth. This is a little off topic, but I feel like it is worth bringing up. I have seen people occasionally compare Byleth to Link, and I find it to be a really silly comparison. Pointing out what archetype a character belongs to is not a defense for the character. Link is in a vastly different kind of fiction than Three Houses. I don't know where these people are getting the idea that Link has this classroom of 13 students who follow him into a dungeon and then have this tragic backstory dumped onto him as we get to stare at an emotionless face. Unlike Byleth, Link actually has emotions. He does have dialogue, but it's generally implied. There isn't really much that the player would need to know that he's going to say. It's not really comparable to Dimitri having a metamorphosis, and all we get to see is Byleth just occasionally emoting at what is supposed to be Dimitri's most powerful character transformation in his entire story arc. Link doesn't have support conversations in Wind Waker where he suddenly forgets that Ariel is his sister and can't say for sure what she is. It takes a very naive understanding of fiction as a concept in order to act like if two characters exist within the same archetype, then it is a defense for the character. I don't want Link in a Fire Emblem game. I want it to be somebody who can live up to the other protagonists we've seen in other Fire Emblem games. Someone who actually looks like they can lead an army, and somebody who can deliver inspiring speeches on the battlefield. Someone who actually has emotions that he can use to connect with different characters. If Mass Effect 5 were to give us Byleth instead of a successor to Commander Shepard, I would be just as upset for the same reasons. It is worse than what we had before. I have never seen a game where the protagonist was so fundamentally terrible to the point where literally any other in-game character would have been an improvement. At this rate, I would rather be playing as Abby from The Last of Us 2. Fates also introduced a hub world mechanic called My Castle. In previous Fire Emblem games, the base was just a menu system where the player can advance to the next battle, manage their convoy, forge weapons, and view support conversations. My Castle iterated upon this idea by having an explorable hub. The player may build different facilities, talk to different characters, or collect items that can be exchanged in the mess hall, accessory shop, or fed to Lilith. It may sound like there is a lot to do here, but it only takes a couple of minutes to zip around My Castle to complete all of the activities and then move on to the next mission. It isn't much of a detour from the core of the game. The Monastery attempted to improve on My Castle, but ended up making it worse. One issue I have with it is that it is completely static. My Castle would grow with the player as they added new facilities and recruited new characters. The Monastery, on the other hand, changes its appearance once during the time skip, which is still largely the same building with rubble in some places. Every character who can be recruited will be at the Monastery in the first half of the game, so it never felt like the army was growing. Any new characters who appear in the Monastery are just temporary plot devices for something later. Looking at you, Monica. In the second half of the game, the Monastery just felt empty because it was missing the other students from the other houses. I understand that this is part of the theme of the game, but it just made the hub world feel too big. The Monastery was designed to be a lot bigger than My Castle. Consequently, it took a lot longer to just travel from one side to the other to complete other activities. The developers tried to mitigate this issue by adding a skip travel system, but let's be honest here, if your game needs a skip travel system so players can quickly roam about the hub world, then maybe it should just be smaller. I also didn't like the actual chores in this mechanic. It seemed like an interesting idea at the start, but it eventually got to a point where I reluctantly performed the other activities instead of just wanting to actively engage with them. A typical day at the Monastery would involve going to different students to raise their motivation if needed, going to the garden and mess hall for stat boosters, checking if the statues can be repaired, performing any advanced drills to improve Byleth's skills, stocking up on weapons and items for the next battle, and whatever other activities are necessary preparations. It was just an overall more tedious experience than My Castle. I would spend about 3 minutes at a time in My Castle preparing for other missions, and about 20 minutes at a time exploring the Monastery to do essentially the same thing, when I would have had more fun simply engaging in an actual battle. A common defense that I have seen for the Monastery is that it's optional. However, it's not entirely accurate to say that. There are actually a lot of consequences for not engaging with this mechanic at all, so let's just take a look at exactly what it means to skip it. For one thing, there is no way to recruit additional students, so the player is unable to use anyone who doesn't automatically join the party. I don't believe it's possible to perform the actions that unlock the Black Eagle's secret route because attending Edelgard's coronation requires talking to her at a specific point in the game while exploring. There are a couple of shops that sell useful items such as black sand steel, which no longer can be shopped at, making it harder to repair weapons. There is no easy way to increase the professor level, which, bear in mind, is tied to the monthly earnings and instruction points, so the player may end up falling behind the difficulty curve since they aren't able to keep this up. There is no way of repairing the 4 saint statues, so the player is completely locked out of those buffs. There is no way of interacting with the garden, cooking, or other activities that may improve performance during battles. It is a lot more difficult to train Byleth in certain skills because they cannot use advanced drills, meaning the avatar has even fewer ways of being customized. Since there is no way of accessing the arena, the player may not have a good way of getting extra money. In fact, it might actually be easier to explain what can be done without the Monastery instead of talking about all the things that can't be done. Skipping the Monastery is technically optional. The player does not have to perform these activities, but there are severe consequences for not doing so. Players should be exploring the Monastery at least once a month, otherwise they are shooting themselves in the foot and making the game a lot harder than it needs to be, while also avoiding a lot of what the game has to offer. I don't know about you, but if I ever feel discouraged from engaging in a core mechanic of a game, then I would rather not be playing the game at all. My Castle did a much better job at being optional than the Monastery. Even if players did not enjoy the mechanic itself, it didn't get in the way of performing other challenges, completing other story missions, or maintaining the army. Since there was no motivation system, there was no concern as to whether or not a character's skills will grow optimally. Since there was no calendar system, my castle activities could be done whenever the player wanted. It was a small enough hub world that it usually only took a few minutes to complete whatever chores were needed before the next mission, which is a lot less time than the Monastery activities. My castle was just overall a better implementation of a hub world than the Monastery, because it actually felt like an extension over the menu system seen in other games, not a chore that I reluctantly participated in. With my grievances towards the Monastery, Byleth, the story, the structure of the story, Byleth, and the character customization out of the way, I can finally begin discussing the core of the game. This is where Three Houses got better for me. I wouldn't put it on the same level as any other Fire Emblem game that I have played, and the reason for my preference boils down to how Three Houses has weird gimmicks that do not add to the gameplay, and an absurd amount of reused maps that defeat the purpose of having alternate routes, since they do not feel like unique experiences. Meanwhile, Fates has gimmicks that actually expand upon the core gameplay and enough maps that justify having alternate routes. Since Fire Emblem Awakening, the series has been bridging the gap between newcomers and series veterans by offering quality of life enhancements that make the game less punishing. The Danger Zones toggle allows the player to see every dangerous tile without selecting each individual unit. Casual mode simply makes the game less punishing since units defeated in battle will return later. In Shadows of Valentia, Mia's turn wheel allows the player to undo moves, and these kinds of changes have all been within reason. Players who do want the original challenge offered from pre-Awakening games can simply opt out of these features. However, there is a new quality of life addition in Three Houses that goes against this design philosophy. Three Houses has aggro lines, which essentially tells the player who is in danger when they finish their turn. I found that this trivialized too much of the strategy gameplay because it made a lot of the turns mindless. I didn't have to account for the enemy making a move that I originally did not expect because I always had a general idea of what the opponent is going to do. The moment I started playing Three Houses, I wanted to disable the aggro lines, but that is not an option. Unlike the other quality of life improvements, the player has to use this one. I don't like the aggro lines because when I'm playing a strategy game, I like to work with missing information, which is not really possible when the enemy is telling me what half their units are going to do next. Since Fates does not have this mechanic, I am inclined to like it more. The main divisive change to the core gameplay in Fates is the removal of weapon durability. Outside of rods and staves, most weapons will not break. I am honestly indifferent to this change. In previous Fire Emblem games, it was hard for me to justify using certain weapons because I would rather save them for a more important time. The question was always, when should I use this, not how should I use this. I honestly prefer having skill caps on weapons they can use when a unit has enough competence with using that weapon, and the weapons themselves have unlimited durability for a game like Fire Emblem, but having it the other way around also has its own merits. Not having weapon durability didn't exactly detract from the core gameplay either, because I still found there to be plenty of challenging missions. I never felt that weapons not breaking was making the game easier, whereas with the aggro lines, I did feel that it made most turns playable on autopilot. I didn't have to think too hard essentially. Perhaps a good middle ground between weapon durability and infinite durability would be making it so weapons have a finite number of uses per map, and that amount gets resetted when the map is cleared, just for the people who are okay with this kind of mechanic. Another new mechanic in Three Houses is a camera mode that allows the player to view the battlefield from the perspective of one of the units. I have to be blunt, I don't see the point of this mechanic. At least with the aggro lines, there were good intentions, and it would have been fine if it was optional, but I don't see where the developers were going for with this one. When adding a new gimmick to the game, it is important to keep in mind whether or not it actually expands upon the core gameplay. Outside Outside of maybe capturing some photos, this doesn't have much utility. Fates does have a core gimmick being the Dragonstone, but this is the difference between a good gimmick and a bad one. The Dragonstone is a new feature that allows the maps to be a lot more dynamic than they were in other Fire Emblem games. The feature is first shown off in Chapter 2, where the player must remove rubble in the center of the map to reveal heal tiles. This sets up an interesting precedent for the rest of the game. Chapter 6 reused the same map from the first chapter, but this time the Dragonstone may be used to drain the river so the units can travel without bridges. At the Ninja Village, the Dragonstone is used to reveal spike pits that damage enemy units when they stand on those tiles, but it will damage your own units as well. Land of Gods uses the Dragonstone to heal party members across the map, but each Dragonstone tile can only be activated once. Essentially, it gave the strategy gameplay layers. Not only was it important to make sure units were positioned correctly to maximize their effectiveness on the battlefield, but meaningful changes can happen to the environment using the Dragonstone. The new camera mode in Three Houses, on the other hand, is part of what gives the impression that the developers just had a lot of ideas but not the time to really evaluate if the ideas were actually good. Three Houses desperately needed a mechanic like the Dragonstone. The maps in Three Houses are generally static. This isn't the biggest deal on its own, but it is an issue exasperated by the amount of times that maps are reused between routes, since it does not offer a whole lot of new content to explore when replaying the game on a separate route. The thing I like about Fates is, even if the story isn't good, there are plenty of maps to make each playthrough on different routes feel unique. Fates does reuse maps, but there are plenty of maps that are exclusive to one route to encourage actually playing other routes. The Birthright route has 23 chapters after the paths split. Out of these chapters, 13 of them have maps that are not visited on any other route. Those are Chapter 8, Chapter 14, 15, 16, 18, and Chapters 21 through the rest of the game. Over half of this route contains maps that are not revisited on Conquest or Revelations. The Conquest route is the same deal. There are 23 unique chapters, and 15 of them are exclusive to this route. Those are Chapters 7, 12, 17, 19, and then Chapters 21 through the rest of the game. The Revelations route also has new maps for returning players. There are 23 chapters, and 16 of them have maps that are not revisited on other routes. Those are Chapters 7, 10, 12, 16, 17, 18, and then Chapters 20 to the end of the game. Over half of these routes is spent playing on new maps that cannot be discovered in the others. The Paralog missions are also unique maps created for the specific Paralog, so there is something new to experience even when just playing the side missions. On the occasions that Fates does reuse maps, usually there is enough time between that the maps are less familiar, and there might be environmental changes as well. For example, on Birthright, Fort Jinya is reached on Chapter 7. This location is not revisited until Chapter 22 of Conquest, where the map layout itself changes as well. So it is the same map, but it feels different enough. The player essentially has to play through the entire game just to see this map again, so by the time it is revisited, the player won't feel like it's just been played. Three Houses, on the other hand, does not have these kinds of advantages. The game is constantly reusing maps between each other. For some parts, it is understandable. If a map takes place in Edelgard's castle, of course it will reuse a map for Edelgard's castle. However, it kind of defeats the purpose in having multiple routes if most of the same maps are going to be reused between them. There isn't much of a gameplay incentive, especially when compared to Fates. On the Black Eagles route, there are 6 chapters that are not shared between the others. Out of these, there is only one unique map that cannot be experienced on other routes, the Tailteen Plains. The rest of the maps can be experienced on either Azure Moon or Dimitri's Paralog, Verdant Wind, the Church route, and other Paralogs. On the Church route, there are 9 chapters that are not shared between the others. Every map on this route can be revisited on other routes. There isn't a single unique map in the Church route. On the Blue Lions route, there are 9 unique chapters. Once again, there isn't a single map that isn't shared between other routes. The only major difference between this route and the Black Eagles is that Edelgard is the final boss and they never visit Shamalama Ding Dong. The only other unique story in the game is on the Golden Deer route, which takes place on Chapter 22 in the Caledonian Plateau, meaning that players who want to play one route in the game and want to visit most of the maps possible might as well just stick to the Golden Deer. It's the only one with a final boss map that is unique to the rest of the game. The paralogs aren't much better either. There are only 5 paralog missions that feature unique maps. Those are the ones belonging to Ash, Flayn, Leonie, Ferdinand, and Claude. Technically, the one with Ash is played in a tutorial mission on Chapter 2, so I'm not quite sure how much that one counts. The rest of them, however, are shared between different paralogs and different story missions. I can find this to be somewhat understandable when 2 maps exist in the same region, but there are times where entirely different sections of the world are inhabiting the same map. For example, Petra has a paralog that takes place in Brigid and shares the same map as Marianne's paralog, which takes place in the forests around Garreg Mach. Brigid is supposed to be a foreign land and sky, hence the name, and this doesn't feel like it is a foreign land and sky when it is literally the same map that is supposed to represent a recognizable territory. The map reuse does not do a good job at justifying multiple routes. It does not feel like these are unique campaigns that are exploring different parts of Fodlan. Outside of the Tailtean Plains, the Caledonian Plateau, and 5 paralog missions, there aren't a whole lot of maps that cannot be explored on one route, which leads to there being a lot of homogeneity between routes. At this point, they no longer feel like 3 separate campaigns. They feel like the same campaign with 3 separate casts of characters and occasional differences in stories. I don't see a point in having alternate routes if they don't feel like radically different adventures. There isn't much reason from a gameplay standpoint to replay 3 houses on a new route. Meanwhile, in Fates, the order of the missions change, the layout of the maps may change, and there are plenty of unique maps to explore. This combined with the awesome Dragonstone gimmick and not having unnecessary hand-holding, I am inclined to prefer the core gameplay in Fates. Despite my complaints, 3 Houses does do a couple of things well in its core gameplay. My favorite addition is the beast enemies. This is another case of a good gimmick because they added an extra challenge that cannot be replicated by fighting the regular opponents. It's not just a feature that looks like it was added for the sake of doing something new instead of doing something that's good. If there is one aspect from 3 Houses that I want to see carry into other games, this would be it. As much as I like the beast enemies though, I don't think they make up for the other downgrades going from Fates to 3 Houses. 3 Houses doesn't do a good job justifying having several different routes. There are only 2 story maps that cannot be encountered on the other routes, so there is little incentive outside of different stories. As I have said before, the discrepancies between the stories before the time skip does nothing but remove context for the other routes. Even when playing just one route, the aggro lines make it so a lot of the game can just be played on autopilot. Fates, on the other hand, did a better job at making each route feel unique by offering plenty of maps that do not exist on other routes, and it didn't hold the player's hand on each individual level. Therefore, Fates overall has a better core gameplay. I understand a lot of people like 3 Houses for what it is. I'm not trying to convince anyone to dislike this game. I simply wanted to express exactly what it was that I didn't like about it. It's fine to like this game, but I can't agree with the review scores that it received, especially when considering the fundamental design flaws that it has. The lack of criticism that this game received at launch does make me a little concerned that the next game is simply going to take what 3 Houses was doing poorly and simply reuse them again for the next game without properly iterating upon them to fix the actual flaws within. To demonstrate some fairness, I do want to take a moment to actually talk about the other things I liked. Not everything in this game was terrible. There are a couple of things that are actually handled well. The problem is all the poorly designed things that surround them. As I said before, I do like the beast enemies. They're a fun challenge to defeat, and if there's one thing from 3 Houses that I hope carries into the future of the series, it would be this mechanic. I like Fog of War. When I play a strategy game, I like to work with missing information, and the Fog of War maps provided additional challenge that the rest of the game was sorely missing. I just wish they used Fog of War more often than 2 paralogs and half of a story mission. Not all of the characters were good, but I liked the support conversations. It was fun to be able to learn about them outside of a major battle. My only complaint is that the ones between Byleth and other characters are arguably the worst ones in the game, simply because the circumstances of Byleth being a silent, stoic avatar character who lacks the emotion to really connect with her students. I heard various opinions of the cast compared to Fates, and I'm not really sure which one I like more. However, if there is one character who stands out above the rest, it would be the Gatekeeper.
Greetings! You must be the new professor.
His lines were fun and quirky. Talking to him once every month was one of the few good things that came out of the monastery. I especially like how he seems to pay more attention to the plot than Byleth does.
There is a masked individual who has been going into town every evening and not returning until the following morning. You see? Nothing gets past this guard.
That's right, I am bringing up an unnamed joke character to say nice things about the game that I do not like. That is how serious I am about being fair when critiquing a game. The soundtrack was fitting. It's not the kind of soundtrack I would listen to on my own, but it does help convey the emotion behind the different scenes. Edge of Dawn was also an interesting leitmotif to keep in the game, and it worked well to convey the different themes in the game. Now, if only it could have been the theme song for a good game.
You serious? You miss your Ollie, we'll be sending you back to Jersey in a coffee can.
Todd said he wanted something big. This is it.
Reach for my hand, I'll soar away into the dawn. Oh, I wish I could stay here and cherish thoughts in peaceful days. I fear the edge of dawn.
However, when I get right down to it, I don't feel that Three Houses has a whole lot going for it. The writing is terrible due to it being a convoluted mess of mysteries that may or may not get resolved depending on which route was chosen, leading to each individual route to feel incomplete. The protagonist was so insufferable that the game would have been better without them. The nuances such as the monastery, calendar, and dialogue system did nothing but add flaws to what would have otherwise been a fine game without them. There is a lot of homogeneity between the stories between each route, so it didn't really feel like it deserved to have 3 separate campaigns. Every individual route feels like the same campaign with a new cast of characters since the gameplay wasn't radically different. Fates, on the other hand, is proof that I would have liked Three Houses without these mechanics and without Byleth. Every major problem that I had with the latest Fire Emblem game either didn't exist or was handled better in its predecessors. The writing in Fates certainly has its issues, but at least Corrin is a tolerable protagonist who I never have to speak for. The story at least feels like the characters are trying to accomplish something instead of meandering around the hub world for a month at a time. My castle is a lot more enjoyable than the monastery, and even if I didn't like it, it's easier to argue that it's optional. The Dragonstone was a fantastic nuance that really needs to be brought back in future Fire Emblem games. Fates is by no means a masterpiece, but from what I have played, it is a much better game than Three Houses. If I were to give them both a numerical score, Three Houses would be a 3 out of 10 and Fates would be a 6 out of 10. If there is one thing that I want to see from the future of the series, it would be Monolith Soft to handle the next game. If there is a more reasonable wish that I could have, it would be for them to not use the split paths gimmick a 3rd time in a row. I don't believe it is a coincidence that the quality of the game started suffering when Intelligent Systems started designing their games around multiple routes. Three Houses bit off more than it can chew, which caused it to become a mess of unfinished ideas and badly implemented concepts. I know a lot of people like this game, but it cannot be denied that there are cut corners. Remember when Edelgard promised to deal with those who slither in the dark when the war was over? Well, that technically happens, but the player never gets to see it. There is just one sentence explaining what happened because adding those missions would have taken too much time. Holst is a character who sounds important, but he never actually appears in the game. He is always too sick to be on camera, and there isn't actually a portrait of him. There are also plenty of characters who show up once and are never mentioned again, as if the game had more grander plans for what they were going to do, but not the resources to implement them. On the Black Eagles route, there is a scene where the player may spare or kill Cloud. However, no matter what they choose, it doesn't go anywhere. I am guessing whatever the scene would have led to was cut due to time constraints. Some of the cutscenes have bad shot composition. The final boss of Silver Snow is especially egregious. Lady Rhea's transformation is just her screaming, the game fading to black, and then Byleth and Sedith awkwardly looking around. It just cheapens the intensity of what is actually happening.
Sedith, it's terrible. White beasts have appeared all over Garreg Mach. It's hard to believe, but there have been reports that the priests and knights have been changing form.
White beasts? Are they the ones Rhea shared her blood and stones with?
The game, as I've said earlier, has the worst case of map reuse in the series. There simply aren't enough maps for the game to cover all the unique missions and paralogs without reusing them an average of 3 times. The time skip was also weirdly handled. All of the students are happy to see Byleth after 5 long years, but for me, the player, it has only been about 10 minutes since I last saw them. Maybe if there was a couple of missions in between Byleth waking up and reuniting with the students, it would have been better, since I would have actually gotten the feeling that it's been a long time since reuniting with these characters. Three Houses simply wanted to do too many things, and it ended up not handling any of them well. At least with Fates, there is a good game with an otherwise poorly written story and a naive protagonist with an annoying price model. The story may not be fantastic, but I can follow along without being irritated by who I have to play as and other logical inconsistencies that happen throughout the story. The strategy portion is fantastic, and the other nuances do not intrude upon the core gameplay. I like Fates, but if the future in the series lies in games like Three Houses, then I don't think it is a series worth supporting anymore. Before wrapping this up, I wanted to show everyone what I believe to be the worst part of the game. In the Silver Snow route, there is a scene just before the last few missions where Dimitri approaches Byleth. He was essentially seeking guidance for his actions.
I wanted to slice her throat, but I did not get the chance. I let people die, and yet I still stand. Rodrigue, Gustav, to do.
I was honestly excited when I saw him. He was the only house leader who hasn't been accounted for at that point in the game. I was honestly ready for him to join my team so the story can finally actually start feeling like it was going somewhere. However, that didn't happen.
I came here to explain my decision. I have no resources to take back the kingdom capital, much less to defeat the Empire, and that is why.
Professor, you will catch a cold sleeping in a place like this.
Byleth woke up from a dream. There is no closure. I do not get to find out Dimitri's fate. The only thing that the scene had to say is the same thing that the first 10 chapters had to say. Keep playing, and maybe you'll find out. This scene is just a slap in the face to me. It made everything feel so pointless. The only reason that it exists is so Silver Snow can be connected with the Blue Lions route. Maybe if I played as the Blue Lions instead of the Black Eagles, this game would have been better for me. However, that wouldn't fix most of the problems that I had with it. I would still despise Byleth for their annoying tendencies in the story. I still wouldn't like how each individual route feels incomplete and is riddled with just missing answers to the questions that I have. I still wouldn't like how often maps are reused between routes. I still wouldn't like the tedious monastery chores. Keep playing and maybe the story actually goes somewhere is all this game wants to say. Because of the scene, the Silver Snow route on its own feels incomplete. In order to get context for the scene, I would have to endure another arduous journey just to find out why this happened. Even with the context, Byleth in-universe never figures out why Dimitri approached them here. They never find out if it was a dream or if he was actually a ghost. They care enough to be surprised about the experience, but not enough to do anything about it. It's never brought up again. It was completely pointless. If it was removed from the Silver Snow route entirely, nothing about the individual route would change. It would arguably be better because it wouldn't be dependent on playing other routes in order to understand what is happening. The biggest problem with Three Houses is that it tries so hard to justify having alternate routes, but the actual justification isn't any good. The gameplay isn't radically different on each campaign. Outside of microscopic differences such as each character's skills, the general composition of each army is going to be about the same. The maps in the first 12 chapters are identical, and even after the time skip, there is plenty of repetition for when a map is re-encountered. The monastery is basically required on every route, and it doesn't change the experience overall. The game wasn't fun for me on the Black Eagles, and the Blue Lions would not magically change that. The story doesn't get much better either. The first half of the game would still be riddled with mysteries that don't go anywhere depending on the route that was chosen. It would still take dozens of hours just to get to that one scene that explains why Dimitri's ghost approached Byleth in a different route. It's not worth it. It's just not worth it. I can understand why people say that Three Houses has a better cast than Fates. Fates does rely too much on archetypes that they are portraying, and they haven't really broken them out into actual characters. However, Fates does a much better job at keeping me engaged in the gameplay on different routes and in the stories. The gameplay has a more striking change between routes. The Conquest route felt more starved of resources than the Hashiden route, which can provide a better challenge for people who aren't comfortable with jumping to the next difficulty, but want a harder game. Three Houses doesn't do anything like this. In Fates, there are plenty of maps, each with their own unique gimmicks, to justify unique routes, since over half of each campaign is still experiencing content that does not exist on other routes. Three Houses barely has enough maps to convey the events of one route without reusing them. The story in Fates doesn't constantly tell the player, keep playing, maybe you'll find out, just for it to be a luck of the draw for if your more pressing questions actually get answered on your first playthrough. I like what Fates tried to do. I don't like how it was written, but it is an otherwise fine game. Three Houses, on the other hand, is bogged down by more than just bad writing. It also has bad gameplay that makes an outright tedious and unfun experience. It took what Fates did well and injected new flaws within them, while Fates at least managed to be a decent game, albeit poorly written. And that is why I say that Fates is a better game than Three Houses. So that just about wraps it up for this video. Normally this is the part where YouTubers ask for likes, comments, and subscriptions, all that jazz, but this is probably going to be a one-time deal. I am not really interested in doing YouTube content. I just felt strongly enough about Three Houses to want to do a negative review of the game, but I didn't really have the angle of it that I felt would convey exactly what I don't like about the game. And interestingly enough, since a lot of people, or at least from what I've seen, a lot of people say that Three Houses fixed a lot of the issues that existed in Fates, but I see it as the other way around, where Three Houses took what would otherwise been a fine game and managed to make it worse by misunderstanding what Fates was doing well. And even with all this said, I'm not entirely sure if I've really covered all of Three Houses' negatives. There's just a lot to unpack here with why I don't like the game, and it even just goes beyond my preferences. I do feel like some of the stuff is just bad game design. I do look forward to seeing the reception of this video. It's already a really unpopular opinion. I figure people will try to make it seem like I am nitpicking or my expectations are too high, but these are my honest opinions of the game. I hope I don't get too many annoying comments from people who are trying to find exceptions in what I am saying while also missing the point entirely. Acting like a smart aleck and putting LOL at the end of everything doesn't actually refute what I am saying, but I do look forward to seeing the more pleasant comments to read. And maybe if I get enough of them, I'll just do a informal video responding to all of them at once. But yeah, don't subscribe because this is probably just going to be a one-time deal.